And you're going to want to watch this because it's a thriller. These relationships are like a thriller, and they just kind of unfold on us in slow motion. So imagine like there's a hurricane and it's tearing through your life, and it just leaves nothing but destruction in its wake. And the abuse, whether, it's rooted in a personality disorder or not, it really doesn't matter. What matters is what's left. And that's usually like this traumatic impact on people. It's a tornado of emotional turmoil. And let's be clear, no one deserves to be subjected to it. No one, not now, not later, not ever. No one deserves that. And these relationships, these narcissistic relationships, they're very one-sided relationships. Being in a relationship with an abusive narcissist is like, playing a never-ending game of fetch with a dog that never tires. Because the supply that they get from taunting us is exactly what keeps them going, keeps them moving forward, and keeps this perpetual abuse cycle going. Because at the end of it, inside these relationships, what you realize is you become an object, a source for their narcissistic supply. And your role is meant to be, your role is just to provide them with, unlimited admiration, unlimited praise, attention, and whatever they need at any given moment, and anticipate those needs ahead of time. It's like you're stuck in a circus act, and they're somehow the ringmaster. We have to counter in different kinds of factors, and that's kind of like the impact of the abuse, the illusions that are formed, and what happens during the unmasking. What happens on the other side of it when recovery begins? And once we're in that unmasking phase of these narcissistic relationships, the narcissist will reveal his false self. And you have to actually beware of that false self. Beware of the narcissist's false self. It's like the plot twist that you never saw coming, because these abusive narcissists, they're just masters of disguise. And they're like ultimate method actors. Just create an identity or a character, and boom, they just become that identity or character. You're not dealing with like one person, you're dealing with multiple people. So no wonder you can't get resolution on one thing, because there's other parts of their personality that are just kind of coming out that also need resolution, all at the same time. They just jump from one to another. And this false self is dangerous. It's something that we need to just be really careful of, because it can be very charming. And it's so different from their true self. And this false self, this false identity, it can be a trap for people into these vicious narcissistic abuse cycles. And once you're kind of trapped in them, it can feel like it's harder to escape than, Alcatraz. And what ends up happening over, repeated cycles of narcissistic abuse is just cognitive dissonance. And understanding cognitive dissonance is a key role and a key step for survivors of abuse to start to understand that they can love themselves again. And the tough part is like breaking free, because, being in love with an emotional predator is like trying to juggle two completely different storylines in your head. And, on one side, you got this false mask that they present to the world, making you believe that that's who they actually truly are. And then you got this evil part, the whole, flaming dragon on the other side. And living in this cognitive dissonance is like sitting in your living room and trying to watch a rom-com while your living room is on fire. It can be just hard to breathe and suffocating even. And the abuse, it comes in so many forms. And it's actually important that we understand the different forms of abuse, the different types of abuse that you can get from a narcissistic relationship. And these relationships with these narcissistic individuals, it's just like, it involves a lot of psychological and emotional abuse. In some cases, it can escalate to physical abuse and sexual violence. And it can get even more complicated when you realize other forms of abuse that exist. There's like institutional abuse, where they'll use institutions to aid in their own abuse. They'll create false stories to police, to judges. They'll figure out ways of just twisting, family law, or, calling IRS or immigration, or whatever institution that they can just kind of create these stories to make your life miserable. And there's more forms of abuse. It can actually take the form of religious abuse as well. This can take the form of, just bullying and being entrapped. It's like, we made vows, I can break them, but you can't. Or claiming somehow that you're a sinner and that somehow God has decided that you're his enemy and you've angered God in some way, and they could be just throwing all sorts of Bible verses at you, just manipulating them and when you actually, the meaning of those stories, they don't even apply to the situation. And the level of this abuse all depends on where your narcissist kind of falls on the spectrum. And sometimes it's hard to pin them down because they're moving up and down that spectrum through lies and deceit. Is that real? Is that real? Or are they actually manipulating me from the beginning? And in society, it's like, there's more awareness that's growing. There's more wisdom that's kind of out there. And we're starting to hear more and more about narcissism. It leads us to question, it's just like, are there more narcissists right now? Or are we just better able to see the ones that we already have in our lives? And it can become almost like a whodunit. And sometimes we get stuck in these loops wondering, is narcissism actually on the rise? Or are we just getting better at spotting it? And overusing the word narcissist, can also have its detrimental effects, because it's more and more commonly used just in everyday language. And it's most commonly used to these days to describe abusive, toxic, Pop-Tarts. Anyone who just in that moment is just lacking any sort of empathy or compassion. And it could leave us sitting here wondering, it's like, are we actually facing this crime wave, or are we just paying more attention to the crime that we didn't see before? And I don't know. But what I can say, just from an observational point of view, is it does feel like we're starting to mainstream narcissism. And the mainstream use of the word narcissism can be both a blessing and a problem. And it's something just to be aware of. Because if it gets taken too far, some people worry that, people who have experienced genuine narcissistic personality disorders might be overwhelmed by those who just casually toss the term around after, difficult breakups or something, just to assign blame. Is it just like an extreme jerk, or is it a full-blown narcissist? When we overuse the word, sometimes, the full-blown narcissist just kind of gets bundled into just someone who's a jerk. And that doesn't help victims. What I can say with some certainty is that narcissists, when we're in that toxic vortex of just this emotions, this maze of manipulation, we end up at the end of it just creating this story of survival at the end. Because the details and understanding all these little intricacies of the disorder is actually less important than it is our interpretation of what our experience was. And then taking that experience, processing it, and eventually moving on. So for me, it's less about labeling narcissists and more about talking about the effects of narcissism and the complex trauma that's actually created in these narcissistic toxic environments. And labels are interesting because once we start taking a deep dive into the meaning of the labels, it's the toxic behavior that we need to kind of focus on and the complex trauma that's left in the wake of these abusive narcissistic relationships. This, to me, is where our focus should actually be pointed on. And the label itself ends up just becoming a distraction. So much of a distraction, it's just actually my advice and my suggestion for anyone is just not to use the word narcissist when you're dealing with narcissists, because calling a narcissist can rarely get to the results that you're looking for. You almost want to say like, oh, you're a narcissist, and you have this fantasy or this illusion that they're going to hear that word and they're going to be like, oh, but God, I do meet all the criteria. Oh. It's like, and it's a fantasy for us. And for them, it's just like, I don't like that label. So I just say, don't call them a narcissist at all. Just avoid it altogether. Because here's the thing, people do cringe at the thought of being labeled a narcissist. And why? Because that label is usually associated with, extreme, chronic, toxic behavior. And it negates the fact that, occasional toxic behavior is actually a human trait. And narcissism, remember, is a spectrum, which means we all have narcissistic traits as part of the human condition. And we're all susceptible to doing it. And you may actually find yourself slipping up once in a while. But the difference is that it's occasional. It's not a pattern. And labeling yourself a narcissist is sometimes even worse than labeling someone else a narcissist. Because for a narcissist, a real narcissist, it's a pattern. And it's not just a pattern, it's a way of life. They wake up one day and that's their life. They can't see it any other way. Whereas if we find ourselves even questioning, maybe I'm the narcissist. Well, that's kind of a key sign that you're probably not. You probably just have narcissistic traits. And all this toxic environment, this emotional abuse that you've gone under, has just kind of brought up some of these traits more. So there's a benefit to using that narcissism label even less. You can know it, you can think it. Calling somebody it isn't going to get the results that you want. And worse, calling yourself something may not get you the results that you want either. And that's just like one end of the spectrum of labeling narcissism. There's another end of the spectrum that's just equally something that we need to be aware of and just kind of keep our minds on. And that's like downplaying narcissism. And this is something we absolutely cannot do. We can't downplay narcissism. This one is like, if we downplay narcissism, it's kind of like, pretending a tornado is just a gentle breeze. It's just a wind. And this gentle breeze just happens to be spinning in a tornado into a funnel. And then all of a sudden, it's just like, wow, there's a flying cow. That's interesting to see one of those during this gentle breeze. Don't see that every day, right? And downplaying narcissism, it can actually make us blind to the actual behavior, blind to what's actually happening in front of us. And downplaying the word narcissist also downplays the severe trauma associated with just a full-fledged narcissistic personality disorder. And this disorder, it's like we're talking more than just, the occasional toxic behavior now and again. NPD involves a complete lack of empathy, extreme entitlement, and just a callous exploitation of others on a repeated basis. All designed for a narcissist's own, personal gain and sense of entitlement. Just callous exploitation of others. Downplaying narcissism is almost like, trying to pass off a lion as a house cat. Yeah, but there's a massive difference between the two. Yeah, they both have fur and, they purr, but one will bite your head off and the other one won't. Now, I think a point I'm trying to make is these narcissistic relationships are complex as hell. Because being in a relationship with someone who has NPD and is abusive, there's no such thing as normal, straightforward breakups. It's not the typical response that, you say, we just kind of grew apart scenario. But no, instead, what ends up being is, it's the realization that the relationship couldn't have worked due to this just malignant abuse. And time plays a big factor in these narcissistic, relationships. And over time, the longer, we're exposed to this narcissistic environment, the more prolonged our trauma bond tends to be. And when we're trying to get out of them, it's almost like, you're fighting quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper the quicksand pulls you in. And even when these narcissistic relationships end, you can still find yourself trapped in this trauma bond, even afterwards, long time afterwards. It's like these trauma bonds, you almost feel like you got your feet stuck in, a cement block. And closure? Closure? Well, that's like chasing a mirage in the desert. It's like always just without reach. As soon as you think you got it, it just vanishes. And all that you're left with is with the knowledge of just being, abused, being mistreated, and, potentially smeared at the end. And these toxic environments, they're really difficult to navigate. Because with narcissism, it's like what we're dealing with is just a lack of empathy and compassion. So it's almost like you grew up with it, so it feels like it's part of gravity. But in these relationships, it's like living in a world without gravity. Facing a narcissist who lacks just basic empathy, respect, and compassion can just be traumatic all into itself. It ends up, just completely contradicting our understanding of human behavior and can lead to just, a series of traumatizing events and keep us stuck in that series inside that locked loop of abuse. And once you're in there, you just realize you wake up and you're in the middle of this just parallel universe where the rules of normal functioning society just don't seem to apply. I hope you like this information. I hope this resonates with you. I hope you find it powerful. And if you do, please, like, share, follow. I have hundreds of videos on my feed. You can follow me on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok, and YouTube.